Assalamu alaikum wa rahmatullahi wa barakatuh. First and foremost, I would like to extend my deep appreciation to IIIT for this gracious invitation to be part of this very important discourse and exchange of ideas in such a climate of amity and friendship and harmony. That's exactly what we need. We need a space where we feel safe, non-intimidated, and at the same time we can exchange ideas without any fear of repercussions or intimidation or any kind of fatwas being issued against us, etc., etc. So I think it's such a healthy atmosphere to be in. In particular, I want to thank Dr. Armin for being so efficient in organizing all the logistics, and he's so prompt in responding. It's hard to find somebody who is a good academic at the same time a good administrator. This is a rare trait to find, and I think we are very grateful to have him as the organizer. I'm going to speak about this very overtaxed and excessively overused term ijtihad again, but from a perspective of the 12 Shi'i school of thought, the Ja'fari fiqh. And although I think many of the things I have to say can be equally applied in the other schools of thought, but my focus is going to remain the 12 Shi'i school of thought. And to do that, I'll just give a very quick overview of this doctrine of imama, one of the pivotal concepts in the Shi'i dogma, which distinguishes it from Sunni Islam, very, very quickly, and then I'll move on, because it is central to the understanding of how religious authority and temporal authority is transferred to the jurisconsult, who regards himself as the indirect representative of the infallible imam. How does this happen? And what is the scope of authority that he enjoys, and what kind of authority is arrogated to him? Basically, you know the story, is that after the succession of the Holy Prophet, there was a crisis of authority. If you want to read more, there's a very nice book by Professor Ayub, called, I think, Crisis of Authority, that's out in display. And he discusses about this particular challenge that happened shortly after the death of the Prophet on the issue of succession. Did the Prophet designate explicitly through Nas al-Jalid somebody to succeed him, or was it left for public decision to be made, public choice? Two schools of thought crystallized, as you know, gradually. There were no Sunni, there were no Shia at the beginning of Islam, at the dawn of Islam. But yeah, there were Sushis. There were Sushis, but there were no Sunnis and there were no Shi'is. Sushi, as you know, is the combination of Sunni, SU from Sunni, and SHI from Shi'i, the hybrid model. That's a new brand that is rising, on the rise, by the way.
It doesn't taste very well.
It doesn't taste very well.
Maybe you haven't tried the right one. It's good for you. It's good for you.
Yeah, look at what's happening in Iraq. I mean, if we had sushis, this would never happen, really. Sushi are very kind-hearted, very compassionate, very loving, very inclusive, very non-judgmental, by the way. Sushis are people with a large horizon and a very holistic worldview.
IIIT.
Like IIIT. Like IIIT. No, really, I mean it. In any event, these two schools of thought that crystallized gradually, two opinions. One was that no, the Prophet had left this for public choice, just like it was the custom and the practice of the Arab culture at the time. He used to decide collectively through this tribal nomination who should be the designated successor. The other school of thought that became known as the Imamiyya or the 12 Shi'i argued that no, the Prophet had explicitly designated his cousin and son-in-law Ali ibn Abi Talib to succeed him. These two tendencies always had this creative tension within them, okay? And you will see the Sunni historians try to minimize the differences in their works because they want to show there was a sense of consensus and ijma amongst all the companions. There was hardly any dispute. It cannot be sustained by historical scrutiny. At the same time, Shi'is would want to argue is that Ali was so distant and he was so remote and he was so hostile, and there's khutbah al-Shifshaqiyya in Nahj al-Balagha, and he just was so full of enmity vis-a-vis the khulafa, vis-a-vis the caliphs and the companions. Although this cannot be, I think, sustained by historical scrutiny. So the truth is somewhere in between. Ali did certainly live very peacefully and very compassionately with the other companions. He certainly was there for consultative advice, and there was exchange of views and ideas. In any event, this issue has remained an issue that has generated great bitterness and great animosity and great fragmentation. What we are seeing today, for example, in the Muslim world, is very much a function of this tension that is still ongoing. The issue of succession, whether Ali's authority was usurped, was he taken over, or the Khulafa, did they have a political vested interest, a political plan, etc., etc. And I think the most controversial issue that Ayatollah Fadullah tried to touch and he got burned was the issue of whether or not, after the death of the Prophet, whether the second Caliph Omar, he came to the house of Ali and did he demand the allegiance from Ali. And the story goes in some historical accounts, but they are subject to question, is that he was trying to coerce Ali to give the bay'ah, and he stormed the door, and you know the story. And then Fatima was hurt and she suffered a miscarriage. This becomes a rallying point, by the way, in the Shi'i milieu to generate hatred, And I think we have to find a way to somehow come to terms and reconcile this kind of issues. Although it is something that happened in the ancient times, it certainly gives a deep sense of identity of who Shi'is are. And I think this is so important to sit down and have this kind of discourse, and to be upfront and to be so honest and forthright, not to be expedient or politically correct, but rather to be very, very honest and forthright that we have this kind of issues, and let's see if we can reconcile them. Otherwise, if they remain underneath the surface, believe me, it continues to corrode, it continues to erode that trust and amity and friendship. In any event, the 12 Shi'is argue the succession goes in the line of Ali through his son Hussein, and Hassan, and then and then Hussein, and then it continues in the chain all the way. They argue, the 12ers argue to the 12th Imam, who is in occultation to the present time. Of course, there were many splits, and there were many splinter groups proliferating. After each Imam, we had other claimants. So after for example, the Mukhtar, for example, he claimed that Ibn Hanafiya is actually the Mahdi, the one whom they are awaiting, and he is the agent of the Imam, and so on. After the 5th Imam, there were more splinter groups, the 6th Imam, and so on and on. There was this proliferation, and people argued that, so-and-so has not died, but rather he's going to be the Redeemer, or the Mahdi, the one who will come at the end of time. Trying to indicate, I want to show is that the notion of Mahdi was very, very central from very early on. The issue was of identity. Who will be the Mahdi? Who will be the awaited one who is supposed to inaugurate peace and justice? Is he born? Is he yet to be born? Is he already born? The Shi'is argued he's already born, and he is the 12th. The Sunni Islam argued, Ibn Khaldun says he is yet to be born. In any event, this chain of the majority of the Shi'is, known as the 12ers, of course there were the Ismaili, the Bohra, the Zaydis, etc., etc. I'm talking about those that sustained as the majority. That the 12th Imam, the Shi'is believe, was born in the year 870 of the Common Era, 255, 256 of the Hijri. And after about 5 years, he goes into this period of minor concealment, or minor ghaiba, or occultation of 70 years, during which he is not accessible to the public directly, but he is accessible via his intermediaries. And he had 4 intermediaries, one after the other. And they were supposed to be the interlocutors between the Shi'i community and the Imam. Because remember, in the Shi'i understanding, the Imams have equal weight and authority as the Prophet. That when you talk about the hadith, for the Shi'i jurists, the hadith of the Imam has equal authority and authenticity as the hadith that would have been transmitted from the Prophet, if it can be validated. Because the Imam is also viewed as infallible, as ma'asum, who cannot be subject to error. He is the legatee, he is kind of the inheritor, the repository of all the knowledge. And some scholars would argue even esoteric knowledge, the esoteric sciences, would also be housed in the person of the Imam. So therefore, for the Shi'is, it is very important to understand that for them there is this continuity of almost, you can say, the apostolic mission is continued, the prophetic ministry continues in some ways, although there are no prophets, revelation has ended, but there is still a continuity of some kind of transmission of knowledge, could be both esoteric as well as the exoteric knowledge, and therefore it carries the same kind of authority as it does vis-a-vis the prophet. That is not to say that the imams are on the same stature or status as the prophet, of course. I mean, they are certainly subordinate and subservient to the prophet, but there is dispute amongst, for example, Sharif al-Murtada, I think he talks about whether or not the imams, when I say imams, I mean the infallible imams as understood in the 12 Shi'i Islam, the capital I. There is dispute whether the imams are superior or not to the Ulul Azam prophets, to the distinguished prophets, meaning Abraham, Musa, and so on. Okay, but anyways, I will leave that, and as Professor Ayub, I think, has a very nice theory, and I think it's very interesting. He argues in some places that Shi'ism really began perhaps as a kind of a peripheral tendency, more towards polarized ends, and gradually there was a moderating tendency from the time of Imam Sadiq, the sixth Imam, and so on. So really, it is not reverting back to moderation, but rather it was a trend towards from polarization towards moderation, and ultimately Shi'is did include the Sunnis as part of the Muslim Ummah, in the sense that one can marry Ahl Sunnah wal Jama'ah, they can meet that is slaughtered by them, etc., etc. And this became a mechanism for the Shi'is to live as a unity, as one body. In any event, after the 70 years, the 12 Shi'is argue in their books of Kitab al-Ghaiba is that the Imam goes into major occultation, during which he will not be accessible to anybody. He is still present. His blessings are still diffused to the community, but he is no longer accessible directly or indirectly, and this created a void and a vacuum as to what shall we do now. The Shi'i community began to pose this question in the interim, because we don't know when he will reappear. The time for reappearance, we are given signs, different kinds of signs that are supposed to precede his reappearance, but we don't know the time. So the issue became what shall we do in this interim, in this void and a vacuum? We need some kind of guidance. At the same time, he is no longer accessible. This starts the process of indirect deputization. This is where you now have the jurists, saying that, listen, we are the closest approximation to the Imam. We can best interpret his will because we are the best trained in terms of his knowledge, ilm, and we have the necessary piety as well. And therefore, if anybody can claim, even if there is no text to prove that we are supposed to be the inheritors, well, we are the best approximators. And of course, they had some text as well. A question was asked to one of the companions, to the Imam, it is said, and the Imam replied that you should refer to my narrators of transmitters, Ruwat al-Hadith, and they are my hujjah upon you, and so on. But this began a process of how to transmit some of that authority, some of that interpretive authority to the Imams, and then from that point onwards to the jurists. The jurists never claimed to be infallible, of course. They always knew that they are subject to question, they are subject to revision, and that's why they write after the ruling, Allahul Alam, that God knows best, I'm open to communication, open to revision. All right? And moving very quickly then. So now we have set the stage for what I want to talk about, this ijtihad. Is that when the Imam is not accessible, then what we can do is we can humanly approximate the best. We do ijtihad, we do juhud. We try to maximize our efforts towards understanding what is my moral, ethical obligation when the Imam is not absent, and we are dealing in the realm of probabilities. It is now the realm of dhann. There is no more yaqeen. Certainty ended. And that's an important transition that Shi'i law had to make, Shi'i legal theory, is that we are now outside the realm of certainty. The Akhbariyun argued that we can have certainty, similar to Ahl Hadith, and they argued that we should not have any mujtahid, any faqih, because we can go back to the hadith of the Imams and we can have yaqeen through the hadith. the Usulis said, no, we have now entered a new realm, the realm of only likelihood, probabilities, and therefore we don't have certainties, and now we need to have jurists and scholars who are going to interrogate all this corpus of literature and come to nothing but probabilities. So, this is where we are. Sharia, so the jurist said Sharia, the way I understand Sharia as the universal norms and values and principles that are supposed to be static, unchanging, immutable, transhistorical, the way Professor Ayub described. And fiqh is that human endeavor, the human exercise to try to interpret, try to best approximate what that particular Sharia ahkam or hukum can be. But it's a human, fallible exercise. And I think that is important, to have that sense of humility and humbleness, that listen, all we are trying to do is, as human beings, trying to understand what is our moral, ethical obligation. So this becomes the fiqh. And the process that is used to get to the understanding of the hukum, that we would call ijtihad. I know ijtihad is also used in a different way by Professor Kamali and others, but I'm using ijtihad as a deductive process, inferential process through which we use the resources that we have, the Quran, the hadith also of the Imams in Shia Islam, the ijma, the way understood by the Shi'is is different than the ijma of the Sunni Islam, and also analogy, but analogy that is clear-cut, that has to be very, very explicit, and it should not become conjectural or speculative. These sources become the fundamental sources, and you will see how they have used other sources as well. Now, up to quite recently, what jurists have done whenever they confronted modern issues like bioethical issues and new contingencies, they tried to tamper, or they tried to use some other kind of juridical devices. For example, they would invoke things like zaman, things like makan, place, the context. They would argue about the qarina, what is the contextual evidence. They will argue things like darura, as was mentioned yesterday by Professor Chedina, is the necessity. Necessity exempts you and gives you certain kind of leeway or dispensation or rukhsa, or you can rely upon haja, a need. All these kinds of things, mashaqqa, hardship, and so on, all these are devices are invoked. You know, whenever you face a new contingency and you want to somehow address the issue. But these kinds of devices do not really deal with the usul. They don't deal with the foundational, or what we would call the structure of jurisprudence or legal theory. They are only what we would call a band-aid solution. What I would call is a kind of a patch-up solution to try to rectify a situation in a particular exigency or emergency. When the emergency is removed, we go back to norm. You see what I'm saying? Is that yes, they've been able to resolve the issue, but the issue was resolved only as a temporary contingency that is not the norm. So it's not really a resolution of the problem, rather it is kind of a temporary band-aid solution that doesn't resolve our theoretical dilemmas that we have. And therefore, there are scholars who argue that we need to have ijtihad, not just in the furu', in all these juridical devices, like, la darar wa la dirar, things like this, these are all juridical devices that we use. Although the maxim la darar wa la dirar can be really amplified, can be used as part of the usul, but I'm talking more about the other devices that we have heard about so frequently. For example, yesterday Professor Brown mentioned that we go and we try and excavate the sources and try to find something. We'll find one person who's going to agree with us, and we'll invoke him, no matter how distant he may be from any kind of coherence or consistency of our theory. So we're not concerned about the coherence or the integrity of the method. We are concerned about how to resolve this issue. For example, riba. They say usury is defined in the hadith is any kind of excess, even a grain of rice. And the hadiths are very graphic, by the way. Some of the hadiths, they say, well, even if you take a grain of rice in excess, this gravity of the sin is so huge, it's like, I don't know, committing adultery on top of the Kaaba, etc. Forgive me, and things like this. It is that grave that the Prophet could not have said these kinds of things. But anyways, how do you resolve this dilemma? You know, when the entire monetary system deals in the interest, and does riba really mean interest, or does it mean exploitative, usurious kind of interest that is manipulative? They're like Visa. What Visa, MasterCard, American Express, they charge 20% interest. But if somebody just charges you 5% interest as opportunity cost, as a risk factor for giving you a loan, could that also be riba or not? And anyway, Fazlur Rahman is a nice article on this. But how would they resolve it? They would say, okay, fine. You know what you do is riba is haram, absolutely haram. But you can still engage in this transaction. How do you do it? One of the jurists said, when you sign the mortgage loan to the bank, because you want to buy a house, none of us are millionaires. I don't know if somebody is, please help us out. But anyways, oh, he is, okay. I'm going to Germany.
$1 million is not what it used to be.
Yeah. It's true. It's true. I am millionaire, but millionaire in Tuman, you know. In Tuman, each dollar is 3,000 Tuman. So I'm certainly multi-millionaire in Tuman, but I don't know, in dollars, we are far off. In any event, how do you legitimize this? How do you validate? So they say, okay, because you are in a state of haraj, you are in a state of difficulty and hardship, when you sign the mortgage contract, you say to yourself, I'm signing this contract, but I'm not signing it with free will. My intention is not to sign, but you just sign. You don't pay them. When the bank starts to say, I'm going to foreclose on you, if you don't pay up, I'm going to take away your house. Now there is a necessity, there is an exigency that if you don't pay them, you will lose the house. And therefore, what do? Now, because the bank is forcing you to pay them, you are paying them, but it's not out of your free will. Since it is not out of your free will, now it is perfectly jaiz, what you call halalize. How can you make halalize things to different kinds of loopholes, different kinds of trickery, different kind of hila or stratagems, different kinds of tricks. And that's what I mean by ijtihad, furu, is that we are playing a game with God, and God knows our intention. So let's be very, very honest that we cannot hide, you know, our true intentions from God. Maybe we can hide and fool other people, you know. But as far as God is concerned, He knows that we are playing a game. Or what they would say is, riba is haram, but you can deal with this. How is this? You come and ask me for $1,000. I say, brother, I love you. I won't charge you interest. I'll give you $1,000 as a principal. But after 1 year, you're going to buy this handkerchief for $100. Do you agree? He says, yes, I'll buy this handkerchief for $100 after 1 year. Now this is a perfectly lawful, halalized transaction, and there is no riba because you really bought something for me as a merchandise, and therefore now we are clear cut. This is what I call trickery, kind of playing tricky games. Sorry?
Hila Sharia.
Hila Sharia. You said kolai shari in Farsi, you know. You're trying to play games with the Sharia. This is known as what I call bandage or patchy solution, playing games. But it's only what you call on the fringes of ijtihad. But ijtihad al-usul is something that is being argued now by other scholars, especially by Ayatollah Mohsin Kadivar, who is at Duke University, people like Ayatollah Mujtahid Shabashtari.
Is he Ayatollah? Mustari is not, no.
He's not?
No.
I thought he has ijazah from Ayatollah Muntaziri many years ago.
Ayatollah.
He can do ijtihad, no?
So can you, right? Ayatollah.
Oh, I thought Ayatollah is a title that...
Ayatollah is a specific title in the hierarchy of
Isn't
ijtihad.
hierarchy at the top?
There are people who can do ijtihad.
But then there are
themselves.
many Ayatollahs who are far junior than me even, and junior than Kadivar. Ayatollah has been, I guess, overused then.
Yes.
Because nowadays, I think, post-Iranian revolution, anybody who agrees with the government becomes Ayatollah. As a matter of fact, you won't believe, one of my friends, Ayatollah Madadi, he's a joker. And he said, he began, when I only had my master's degree, they would call me Agay Doctor, and everybody calls me Doctor. And I only had my MA degree yet. I said, wow, this is nice. I already became a doctor by a few people calling me Doctor. He said, listen, if you want to become Ayatollah, I can do that as well for you. Just bring a nice briefcase of crispy $100 bills. That's like tiryak, It smells like cocaine, just crispy $100 bills, we can make you, after calling you a few times Ayatollah. So I'm sorry, I didn't know that Dr. Kadivar is a mujtahid then. He's a mujtahid, right?
Kadivar is Ayatollah.
He is Ayatollah. Okay. So then we have dissenting. But certainly he's a mujtahid. I know that he has ijtihad, I mean the letter of certification that he can do ijtihad from many scholars, and many years ago, including Ayatollah Muntazari. But he is on the cutting edge of being the spokesperson that we need some kind of what he calls structural ijtihad or foundational ijtihad that is not just tampering or tinkering with the furu, but rather dealing with the methodology itself. You know, what Professor Chidina was arguing, we need to bring in, for example, theology has to enter the field. We need to bring in hermeneutics. We need to bring in interpretive tools. We need to bring in cosmology. We need to bring in things from the Sufi literature. All these things have to be added, you know, to make it an intelligible and a vibrant method. And this is what he argues. Shabastari also has some very interesting ideas in hermeneutics especially, and I'm sure Professor Vishanov will have a lot of stuff to say. He has a book on this issue, and when I was in Iran recently, I could not find a book of Shabastari anywhere. I was told by the bookstore, don't even ask that question, you know, because he's a sensitive person and we don't circulate. But I did find actually, you know, DVDs and CDs of Dr. Surush, surprisingly, you know, on some of the bookstores on Amir Khan and so on. Anyways, there are other scholars as well, like Ayatollah Fadlallah, Muhakkik Damad, Ahmad Qabil, and Muhammad Jannati, and Musa Bujnurdi, who to some extent are also dabbling in ijtihad at the foundational or the structural level. Now, between both these schools of thought, those who want to do ijtihad, the usul and furu, they both agree that certain things in Islam should not be touched. They are untouchable, unchangeable, they are static, and they are sacrosanct. They would say aqidah, belief system like prophecy, belief in the Quran, the belief in Day of Judgment. All these things must be left untouched because they are supposed to be, they are not context bound, they are not time bound, they are supposed to be perpetually relevant and equally valid. They would also argue, most of them, they would say ibadat are of a similar categories, acts of worship like prayers and fasting and so, pilgrimage are also supposed to be static, they are not time bound, they are not context bound, and they should remain perpetual. It is argued by Dr. Kadivar that even things of consumption like eating and drinking, he argues, this also should be untouched, because we don't know, for example, exactly why, you know, this such and such a thing has been prohibited to consume. So what we do is, since we don't know the reason, we don't know why we are asked to pray 3 rakat prayers or 2 rakat prayers in Fajr, let's say. We just take it for granted. We don't know the efficacious cause of causality or illa, and therefore we just take it for granted. I want to say is that I don't think this is sustainable, because if you want to argue that mu'amalat are subject to change, and if we can change things like inheritance, we don't know the illa in the Quran, why it is 2 to 1. It doesn't tell us 2 to 1. Why? You know, on some issues we know the illah. For example, in testimony we know it has to do with memory loss. But in the case of inheritance, Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala does not tell us what is He just gives us the ratio one after the other and period. But we can now assume, hey, we're living in a patriarchal society, women were taken care of, men were the breadwinners, etc., and therefore the diya is 2 to 1 ratio because men was, and so and so. But this is our understanding, you know, of why this particular hukm was there in the Quran. So if we are prepared to do that and go against the nas, then we can do that also for prayers. Prayers also had a particular rationale. And we can rationalize what was the reason, and we can engage in that same kind of objective as we do for salat without necessarily performing the 5 ritual prayers. So then we become open. It becomes an open sphere. And this is what I call a slippery slope, where it becomes very fluid. So I think we need to also find a way to give some kind of parameters and structure to it rather than leaving it all open. That open game for everyone to do as they like. But I'm saying theoretically, if you want to dabble in mu'amalat as an open sphere for human intervention, human interjection of cause without an explicit nas from the Quran, then I see no reason why ibadat cannot also be open for that kind of analysis. So, in conclusion, thank you. In conclusion, you know, those who are in favor of ijtihad al-usul, they want to argue is that we really need to bring in the other sciences. bring in modern sciences. You cannot have a mujtahid or a faqih anymore who is just specialized in the usul. You can have a person who is a mastermind, let's say in the usul, but if he doesn't know the other disciplines, he will not be able to come to the right deduction, the right conclusion, and therefore there is a movement that calls for collegial ijtihad. There is some kind of a ijtihad of a committee, you know, or you can be a mujtahid on a particular issue. Let's say on bioethics, you are the expert, you do your own ijtihad, which is very particularistic, and then I can do my ijtihad if I know economics and so on, or we make a collegial body and we engage in this multidisciplinary, where we invoke the other sciences and where we invoke a culture of humility. You know, humility in the sense that I don't know it all, you know. I mean, if we can just accept this as human beings, that listen, we are fallible, subject to error, we are humble human beings, I think it can really resolve a lot of issues. I went to a book exhibition and there are all these books of Ayatollahs, and everybody is Ayatollah al-Uzma. Al-Uzma is a superlative, the grandest jurist, right? Right? Now everybody is the grandest jurist. I don't know who is the grander of the grander. Who is the greatest of the greatest? Well, somebody did have. He said, I'm Ayatollah al-Uzma fil alameen. In the entire universe, the cosmos. I'm the only one. Okay? I'm saying it's a joke, but I mean, I didn't see this, by the way. So don't say that, you know, I said this. I didn't see in the book exhibition. But I'm saying that one could argue that, there is no more scope to say ta'abbudi. You can't say that this is something I have to do willy-nilly, blindfoldedly, because it is part of my, responsibility to God as just ta'abbud. If you want to open up the sphere, then I see problems. Things like mawdu' that we did in the previous ijtihad of the furu', there is scope. If you change the context, then you can change the ruling. For example, the issue of mahar. They give the example of mahar is that mahar, has to change depending upon which time period you are living, what are the economic standards, and so on, etc., etc. And one thing that Ayatollah Khomeini did that was very, very interesting is he realized the deficiency in the present day ijtihad. He realized, Ayatollah Khomeini was very sharp, he realized that the hands are tied when it came to developing new policies that deal with contemporary issues of governance, It is one thing to talk about specific issues like, riba, but if you want to talk about global issues, he realized he's coming to a bombast, to a dead end. And that's why he created this committee, the Tashkhis and Maslahat, a committee that is in charge of defining public welfare. And he himself said that I believe that the state has authority that transcends the authority even of primary injunctions like the awwaliyya, like prayers and fasting. He says he can override the Sharia as the state leader. He has al-wilayat al-mutlaqa. Why does he say this? I believe because he realized the present day ijtihad does not resolve the issues, and therefore he had to invoke al-wilayat al-mutlaqa. But I'm saying rather than al-wilayat al-mutlaqa, perhaps there is a way for us to do so by dealing with ijtihad al-usul, by invoking, like I said, other sciences, including theology, hermeneutics, and the other cosmology, and so on that I mentioned. Thank you very much.